Are my solar panels in the best position? That's a question I asked myself recently, just over 12 months since they were installed. Strange question, you might think, as what would I do about it if they were? It's not like I'm going to climb up on the roof and start moving them around, or am I? A couple of things triggered this line of thought. The first was that I've been thinking about putting together a video with my top 10 recommendations for people considering getting solar installed. Based on our first year of experience, this would include lessons we've learned and knowledge we've gained. And ensuring your panels are installed in the best location seemed a strong contender to make the list. The second was that one of my neighbours has now had solar installed himself, and his panel arrangement is slightly different, despite him having a very similar roof structure and living just across the road. So how did I go about finding out whether our setup is generating as much as it should? And what am I going to do about it? Keep watching to find out more. Hi, I'm Chris and welcome to my channel. If this is your first time here, thanks for taking a look. I try to post a video every couple of weeks or so, covering a variety of typical handyman and householder stuff, ranging from solar power to home automation to DIY, tool reviews and much more besides. If you enjoy this video or find it useful, please do hit the like button as it helps me reach a wider audience. And also consider subscribing if you want to see similar future content. To everyone who's already subscribed, I'd just like to say thanks for your support and comments. Your feedback is always appreciated. On to the video then, which comprises three main sections. The first focuses on the performance we should expect from our solar installation and what we actually achieved in our first year. The second covers how I went about determining if my solar panels are actually in the optimum position for power generation. And finally, in the third section, I look at whether I could add more panels into the system in a cost-effective way. I've put timings for the start of each of these sections in the description below. Okay then, let's do a quick recap of our system. We're located in West Lancashire in the northwest of England, not too far from Liverpool. Our system was installed in late July 2022 and comprises two banks of 6 Jinko Solar 375 watt panels installed on broadly east and west facing roof pitches of around 41 degrees. We have a Solis 3.6 kilowatt hybrid inverter installed in the garage, together with two Pylon-Tech US 3000C batteries, giving us a total storage capacity of 7 kilowatt hours. All told, we paid a shade under £11,000 for the system. Before looking at our first 12 months output figures, it makes sense to first consider what we should expect from our system. If you're a regular visitor to this channel, you'll know that I like to make use of the JRC PVGIS tool created by the European Commission. You can find it at the link shown on the screen and also in the description below. If you're located in the US, you might instead want to make use of the PVWatts calculator located on the NREL, that's the National Renewable Energy Laboratory website, which does a very similar thing. Again, you'll find a link in the description below. Both of these tools require some key information entering in order to calculate your projected annual solar generation. This includes your location, size of your panel array in kilowatts, slope, tilt or angle of your panels in degrees, and azimuth in degrees, the latter of which describes the direction that your array faces. While most of this is relatively straightforward, just a slight word of caution when entering the azimuth figure, as different tools assume different base criteria. For example, the PVGIS tool requires the azimuth to be entered as the angle of the PV panels relative to the direction due south. Example, minus 90 degrees would be east, 0 degrees would be south, and plus 90 degrees would be west. The PVWatts tool, on the other hand, requires the azimuth to be entered as the angle clockwise from true north, in which case plus 90 degrees would be east, plus 180 degrees would be south, and plus 270 degrees would be west. So just make sure you enter the data correctly. As my panels are split across two banks, each bank has a different azimuth angle, which standing with my back against the house wall and using the compass facility on my phone, I determined as -80 degrees and +110 degrees respectively, as shown, ready for input into the PVGIS tool. Using the tool, we can then calculate the projected monthly output for each bank of panels in turn. Taking the figures for both the east and west banks and adding them together, we get the projected annual output for my 4.5 kilowatt system of approximately 3,329 kilowatt hours. Okay then, so how did we do over the first 12 months? Well, as you can see, in general, our actual output followed the projected output pretty closely, although it's clear that we had a few bumper months together with a couple of damp squibs. August 22, May and June 23 were not far off 25% above projection, whilst March 23 just let the side down somewhat. In my June monthly review, I had held out the hope that we'd get a third consecutive month of above average sunshine in July, but alas it was not to be, as we suffered significant amounts of rainfall. Having said that, the July sunshine levels were only just below the projection, as you can see. Rearranging those numbers and showing them as running totals, we can see that we generated 3,606 kilowatt hours, which is about 8% above the projection from the PVGIS tool. In terms of value, that's electricity we either consumed or exported, we were just a shade under the £1,000 mark. So on a very simplistic calculation basis, that would imply we're likely to achieve payback around 11 years after installation. Though of course that's highly dependent on how energy prices vary over the coming years. So basically, it's anyone's guess. Okay, so now we know how our system performed over the last year in comparison to what we might reasonably expect. How do we determine if the panels are actually in the optimum position? Well, my first thought was to see if we could deduce anything from data provided by the inverter. So using Solis Cloud, I was able to pull the DC power traces for both banks of panels, PV1 being the trace from the east bank and PV2 for the west bank. The traces shown here are for the 30th of May, which was a pretty decent day with almost continuous solar coverage, apart from the clearly visible dip around 10:30 in the morning when a cloud must have passed over. Whilst these traces indicate we're generating more power from the east bank than the west bank, the PV1 trace being taller and wider, they don't really tell us much more. Additionally, within Solis Cloud, this data can only be displayed on a day-by-day basis, so there's no easy way to aggregate the data over a longer period, say for a month or a year. Finally, there's no way to see how the individual panels are performing, as my system is not fitted with solar optimizers. As an aside, if you want to know a little more about solar power optimizers and the related topic of microinverters, then do consider taking a look at Gary Does Solar's excellent videos on these subjects. But please, not before you finish watching this video first. I've included links to both of those videos in the description below. Where next then? Well, if we go back to the PVGIS data, we can at least get an indication of the relative proportion of power that should be generated by each bank. Whilst I've classed this as theoretical, it is based on proven solar radiation data, so should provide a reasonable pointer to how my system is working in practice. On this basis, it looks like my east bank of 6 panels should deliver around 1,733 kilowatt hours per year, whilst the west bank should deliver around 1,596 kilowatt hours. So my east bank should deliver around 52% of the total power, with the west bank correspondingly generating around 48%. Which of course raises the question as to whether we should have put more panels on the east bank and fewer on the west if we wanted to maximise our power generation. Given what we've just learnt from the PVGIS data, I wondered if it was worth another look at the actual inverter data from my system. Pulling up the PV traces for the 30th of May again, exporting the data into a spreadsheet and then doing some number crunching allowed me to calculate how much power was actually generated by each bank in 5-minute time slices. And on this particular day, the split worked out to 55.5% from the east bank and 44.5% from the west bank, i.e. confirming that I was getting more power from the east bank than the west bank, albeit that the difference was greater than the PVGIS figures would have suggested. But that's just for one day. So could I repeat this calculation and get a more complete data set? Well, yes, I could repeat the process ad infinitum and build up a mass of data, but even I'm not that much of a glutton for punishment. With each day's trace taking around 67 minutes to call up, download and process, each month would have taken me around 3 to 4 hours to do, depending on tea breaks of course. And not all days would have had such nicely proportioned traces, making any calculations a bit more involved and the conclusions potentially suspect. Instead, I chose to just find the best trace around the middle of each month and analyse those. It wouldn't be perfect, but it should give me a pretty good idea of the actual power generated by each bank throughout the year. Even so, it was still a real chore. The things you do for YouTube. Tabulating this data for the months from March through to October gave me an average split of the power generated from each bank. Why just March to October? Well, I reasoned that these were the main solar generation months and thus likely to give the most representative data. And also the fact that I was missing significant chunks of data from November to February due to issues with Solis Cloud during that period. I've covered those in one of my earlier videos for anyone who's interested. Anyhow, based on this methodology, I came up with figures of 55.8% versus 44.2% for the East and West banks respectively. Comparing the figures from the two methodologies, we see that whilst they're different, they both would indicate we're generating more power from the East Bank, and thus that perhaps we should have put more panels on the East Bank and fewer on the West if we wanted to maximise our power generation. But what and where? Looking at the layout of our roof, I didn't think it was sensible to consider the two rearmost pitches, i.e. the ones I've highlighted with red crosses. My thinking was that there'd be a degree of shading caused by the raised centre roof sections for significant portions of the day. And working on the basis that we couldn't squeeze any more panels next to the existing banks, as I wanted to maintain clear space for roof maintenance and access to those panels, the only other option was the two raised sections shown highlighted with question marks. After taking some rough measurements, I estimated that we could potentially fit up to 4 panels on each of these roof sections, although the east section does have a solar tunnel incorporated into it, which might make things a bit of a tight squeeze. Starting from the current setup of 6 panels in each bank, I then went through the process of modelling adding 1 more panel to the east bank and 1 fewer to the west bank, and determining the PVGIS projected power in each case. I repeated this all the way up to 10 panels on the east and just 2 on the west. For fun, if you can call it that, I also went the other way, but just for one step, as it's immediately apparent that the total projected power would be less than with the current setup, which is what you'd expect. So what does all this tell me? Firstly, if we'd have favoured installing more panels on the west bank and fewer on the east, our total power generation would have been less than we currently get. So definitely not a case of go west, young man. Secondly, if we'd have favoured installing more panels on the east bank and fewer on the west, we could have increased our power generation, but only by the relatively small amount of 92 kilowatt hours per year. That's an increase of around 2.5%. That equates to just £27.60 per year at a nominal 30p per kilowatt hour, which is pretty minimal in the overall scheme of things. Those figures might be a little higher if we based our analysis on the inverter-derived power generation split rather than the PVGIS data, but either way, it's not going to be that significant. Of course, the one downside to favouring one side of the house over the other is that we'd end up with a very unbalanced or asymmetric generation profile. I've tried to illustrate what this might look like if we'd have maximised the number of panels on the east-facing bank, i.e. an East 10, West 2 configuration. Whilst this is just a sketch rather than an actual trace, hopefully it conveys the point and shows the difference to the more equal East 6, West 6 setup that we currently have. With such a configuration, the majority of power would be generated by mid-afternoon, which could be a big disadvantage if you had no battery storage or export payments. However, it would possibly be less of an issue if one or both of those were available, as is the case with our system. Or are there any other disadvantages I've not highlighted? I'd welcome your comments. So what conclusions can I draw? Firstly, our panels are not quite in the optimum position if we wanted to absolutely maximise our solar generation. But the lost output appears pretty minimal at around 92 kilowatt hours per year with a value of around £28. The equal 50-50 panel arrangement that we currently have, in my view, offers a good balance between total output power and daily generation profile. I accept this is probably what you might realistically expect for a house that's oriented almost perfectly east-west. However, during the pre-sales process, our supplier didn't provide any detailed analysis that justified the 50-50 panel split that we ended up with. All we got was an overall projected annual output, which in retrospect also appears around 5% lower than the PVGIS projection. So how they got their numbers is anyone's guess. The question it raises in my mind, however, is if our house had been situated a bit further off true south, such that the azimuth figures for east and west were, say, 10 or 20 degrees different than now, would a 50-50 panel split still have been proposed, and hence result in a significantly less optimum setup? Of course, I can't answer that question, but it does suggest we can draw some further conclusions. These are that the PVGIS tool seems to give a reasonable correlation to actual inverter-derived power profiles, and thus it, or similar tools like PVWatts, could be used to help inform optimum panel positioning, particularly where the roof configuration is not just a straightforward south-facing pitch. If nothing else, it provides additional information to someone considering investing in solar with which to review supplier proposals. My panels might not be in the perfect position for maximum generation, but at least I don't have to scrabble up on the roof and start moving them about, as if I ever was going to. So job done, I can relax and go back to watching the rugby. Or can I? So could I add some more panels? Well, of course, but I'm not up for investing in yet another inverter with the associated expense, complexity and installation hassle. Instead, could I add more panels and squeeze a bit more from my existing inverter? Thinking back to those DC power traces for each bank of panels that we looked at earlier, the thing that really struck me was the maximum peak power that each bank was generating. Revisiting the traces for the 30th of May, we see that the East Bank pushed out a maximum of 2.15 kilowatts around 9:30 am, whilst the West Bank pushed out 1.81 kilowatts around 3 pm. Of course, whilst the individual peak power from each bank of panels is of interest, what we actually need to determine is the maximum DC input power from both banks combined. Doing some simple calcs on the export data from these traces shows that the maximum input power the inverter would see would be around 2.83 kilowatts at about 12:05. That's nowhere near the peak DC input power the inverter might expect to see if we had all 12 panels totaling 4.5 kilowatt capacity located on a true south roof orientation. Even at a slightly pessimistic 90% yield, with such a setup we'd see over 4 kilowatts hitting the inverter around noon on a bright sunny day. So surely I could push my inverter a bit harder than is currently the case, especially given that the recommended maximum PV DC input power for my inverter is 7 kilowatts, which we would never be anywhere near reaching. But just to be thorough, I did the same calculation for all 8 months for which I had DC power export data, as shown here. In most months, the inverter never sees more than 3 kilowatts of DC input power, with just July hitting 3.4 kilowatts, still well below what we might expect if our 4.5 kilowatt array was on a south-facing aspect. Now, of course, this dataset is just based on a sample of one day in each month, but I think it's representative of the situation we'd experience on the sunniest days, given I looked for the peakiest traces in the middle of each month. So the way I see it, I could squeeze a few more panels into my array and connect them into the existing inverter, thus increasing my power generation capacity throughout the year with the minimum of expense. So what I'm suggesting is that I just oversize my panel array a bit more than is currently the case. I'm not going to dive into oversizing in great detail. There's a reasonable article at the link shown that's worth a read if you're interested. But in essence, oversizing means having the capacity to produce more DC power in a system than the inverter can effectively turn into AC energy. Whilst that might seem counterintuitive to the thinking that you should aim for an equal amount of DC power coming in as AC power going out, this would only be true if the panels always produced at their maximum stated output levels. But as we've seen earlier, they don't, and on some days that equates to a lot of lost solar power generation capability. To empower the inverter to produce as much as it can, it actually makes sense to enable more DC capacity in than AC capacity out. Of course, none of this is new. It's pretty standard industry practice to oversize the panel array. Now, my current 12 panel 4.5 kilowatt array is already oversized by a factor of 25%. That's calculated by dividing the DC panel capacity of 4.5 kilowatts by the AC output capacity of the inverter, 3.6 kilowatts. But as we've seen, given our location and split bank panel setup, I would argue that's very conservative. The obvious question then is, how far could I increase our panel capacity and thus the oversizing factor whilst ensuring the system continues to operate safely and reliably? Assuming for now that we used a 400 watt panel size, we can make some calculations and estimates. Just adding one 400 watt panel to both the east and west banks, bringing the total array size to 5.3 kilowatts, could increase our annual output by 18%. In this configuration, our oversize factor would increase to 47%, but I estimate that we'd realistically never see more than 4 kilowatts of DC input power at the inverter, and then only on the sunniest of summer days for a brief period of time. Taking it one step further, and adding two 400 watt panels to both the east and west banks would take the array size to 6.1 kilowatts, which could increase our annual output by 36%. The oversize factor would increase to 69%, and the estimated max DC input power at the inverter would be around 4.6 kilowatts. For both of these expanded configurations, I've currently just assumed we'd add the additional panel capacity equally on each bank. But what do you think? Is that what I should do? Okay then, we'll leave it there for now. Thanks for sticking with it if you've made it this far. I'm pretty much decided what I'm going to do, but I'd certainly value your thoughts, comments and suggestions. Thanks for watching. Hope you found it interesting and informative. Please do like, comment and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Cheers, and hope to see you again for the next instalment.